raising our voices to remaining silent, explore how and why words matter. Having Rabbi Telushkin here tonight, the author of Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, is a natural fit for our Global Day event. His books will be available for purchase after his presentation, and we'll be doing a book signing in the lobby. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and now please join me in welcome Rabbi Telushkin to the podium.
It is wonderful for me to be back in Memphis. I have extremely warm memories of being here, and I can never come to Memphis without encountering a wiser. So this is a great return. And Rabbi Jonah, where is Rabbi Jonah? I'm looking forward to meeting you. Okay, hi. I really am speaking about, actually, can somebody lend me a watch? I'm not about to do a magic trick, but I don't want to keep looking at my cell phone. If I take this off, does that also work?
You can do whatever you want.
Okay, thank you. Hi, great. Okay. It's 5:15. Okay, after my speech, I'll go back and forth. After my speech, I also want to do a little postscript. I want to briefly review the 613 commandments. I really do want to speak about words. In 1996, I published the original edition of my book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal. And it had a bit of an impact at the time. I tried to get a National Speak No Evil Day established in the United States. I was able to get 2 senators. Joe Lieberman was a Democrat, Connie Mack was a Republican. Actually, there were things that could be done together by Democrats and Republicans in those days to sponsor a National Speak No Evil Day in the United States. I remember at the time I said such a thing was important because I really couldn't imagine civil discourse in America getting any worse. You now know something important about me, I am not a prophet. But the thesis of what I wanted to say then, and it's now, because of a number of events that have happened, it's something I want to elaborate on. My working thesis is that unless you or someone dear to you has been the victim of terrible physical violence, there's a good chance that the worst pains you've suffered in life have come from words used unfairly, from excessive anger, from excessive criticism, from gossip, from rumors, from nicknames. How many people here ever had a nickname you really disliked? What was it? Okay. People at a certain point knew that you disliked it, but continued to use it. People sometimes say that they think I'm exaggerating the significance of words. You know, people say, oh, it's only words. And of course, there's that famous line that children would use, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. But the truth is, throughout history, words have motivated people to pick up sticks and stones and knives and guns to hurt other people. On a communal level, almost all sufferings of communities originated with words. And there's a very specific reason for it. Violence against communities rarely comes out of nowhere. The power of words is to dehumanize the people so that when people later on do terrible things to them, they don't feel that they're doing it to fellow human beings. So in other words, Jews were characterized, we know throughout history, as Christ killers, which had the effect of aligning Jews, so to speak, with the devil, with Satan, and then eased away. There was a reason so many offensive words were created to describe black people. Because people were doing terrible things to them, which they couldn't do to other human beings if they saw them as human beings. And that's why we have to be very, very careful. Now, I want to speak about this a little later. That's why movements like BDS are so awful, because they're singling out and trying to depict Israel as actually being the most wicked country in the world. And it has even caused, again, a charge of genocide. Genocide is the modern equivalent of the blood libel. You know, in the medieval period, Jews were accused that they would kill non-Jews and drink their blood. There was actually a very interesting comment made about that by the cultural Zionist figure, Achad Ha'am. He said there's only one good thing that can be said about the blood libel. You know, you wonder, what is he possibly going to say? He said, because normally, when the world has a widespread perception of a certain people, you start to wonder, can the world all be wrong and we alone are right? And then he said, along came the blood libel. It was universally believed. Along came the blood libel, we know the whole world can say something and can be utterly false. That's one of the things that gives us the power to stand up against the attempts to equate Zionism with racism and to depict Israel in such evil terms. It is therefore very important that we be careful, obviously, in the sorts of words we use, which do try and dehumanize. I remember many years ago, I was speaking to Yehuda Bauer. Yehuda was an historian in Israel and was one of the early major historians who wrote on the Holocaust. And Bauer, I remember he said to me, and it's not a term used as much now, but how many of you remember when they would often say the Nazis exterminated 6 million Jews? How many of you recall the word exterminated being used? And Bauer said, I've never used that term. The Nazis used that term. They wanted to make it seem like Jews were rodents. So even there, we have to be very, very careful. And I remember even in terms, whatever one's position is on immigration, whether you feel it should be more open borders or less, whatever it is, I remember years ago I'd done an interview one year with Elie Wiesel, and then one year with A.M. Rosenthal, who was at the time, who had just finished his tenure as the editor at the Times. And I remember Elie Wiesel said he didn't like the term illegal aliens, because he said, how can you define a human being as illegal? And then Rosenthal had an interesting comment. He said, I don't like the use of the term aliens, because it makes it seem like these are not human beings, but they are figures from another planet. So words can have a very powerful effect. I learned that, by the way, when I was working on the book on the Rebbe. And I remember one of the things I learned, I don't know if you had any such hospitals in Memphis, but my mom told me that when she was growing up in New York, and my mother was born quite a long, my mother's a lot of shalom's all over her life, but she was born in 1912. And she told me when she was growing up, they had hospitals in New York called Homes for the Incurables. Did they have such hospitals down here? My mother said it was shocking. You know, she said she's embarrassed that when she was a kid, it didn't strike her as such a terrible term. But, you know, as she got older, she thought, imagine going into somebody's room and saying, oh, by the way, we're transferring you tomorrow to the Home for the Incurables. You know, what that can do to people. And the Rebbe, I learned, this way I'll be able to guess. Call out the answer if you know it. How many people here know Hebrew? Just call out, how do you say in Hebrew hospital? Okay, quite a number of people knew it. Right. What does Beit Cholim literally mean? I mean, obviously it means hospital, but what does it? It means home of the sick, house of the sick. The Rebbe thought that was a terrible term. He said, call it Beit Refuah, the house of healing. He said, because words mean a lot to people. When a person is defined as being sick and he's a long-term stay in a hospital, it really diminishes a person's enthusiasm, optimism, and he said it's actually also true to the meaning of the word. You want to get cured there. That's what the hospital's goal is. There was another term also that the Rebbe didn't like. There's a term commonly used in Israel. Many of you probably know the word for the army in Israel is tzahal. The acronym meaning Tzva Haganah Israel, Israel Defense Forces. And soldiers who have been badly hurt, permanently hurt, not the sort of handicap, were called, anybody know what the term is for handicapped soldiers? Nechei Tzahal, the handicap of the Israeli army. And in 1976, so it means it was in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, which was in 73, a group of these Nechei Tzahal, these handicapped soldiers of Tzahal, were given a trip to the United States, in part to lift their spirits, in part to make contacts with doctors here. And among the places they stopped was 770, the headquarters of Chabad. The Rebbe met with them. And the Rebbe's public speeches were almost invariably in Yiddish. In later years, he sometimes spoke in Russian, because so many Russian Jews got out, and he was a native. And he rarely gave public speeches in Hebrew, but he did on this occasion when speaking to the soldiers. And he said, I know that in Israel they call you the handicapped soldiers. He said, but why should that be the only way in which you're defined? It's known that people, when they lose a certain ability, a certain skill, or a certain, something that they can do, they often develop compensatory strengths. In other words, blind people often develop a more acute sense of hearing. It's not that they necessarily hear better than us, but they pick up on the significance of the sounds. If you would Google later today, people who paint without hands, you will find remarkable paintings by people who painted either with a brush in their mouth or with a brush between their toes. You'd be shocked. So the Rebbe said, why then should you only be defined by what you can't do? Why can't you be defined by what you can do and do very well? Why can't you be called Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the excellent ones of Tzahal, instead of the handicapped of Tzahal? And it was very, very moving because these people were profoundly moved to see themselves in a different way, to see themselves by their strengths. I remember I was once reading a memoir of an American soldier who had lost both arms in World War II. And he was sent, obviously, to an Army rehabilitation hospital. And the day before he was released, a high officer in the Army came to speak with him and the other soldiers who were about to be released. And he spoke to them in what I suppose you would later on call tough love. He didn't want to be too sentimental. So he said, this year you're going to be heroic Army veterans. Next year you're going to be handicapped Army veterans. And by year 3 you'll just be thought of as cripples, to prepare them. So that's how they were sent out into the world. So again, this is another way, because the speech I want to give today is both about words that hurt and words that heal. And thank God there are words that heal, because it has to be something compensatory if words can hurt that much. And we can do it. And we know how much words matter. Every single person in this room has had the experience of reading a novel and being so moved by the fate of the character in the novel that you loved the character, you hated the character, you cried, and yet the character never existed. All that happened was that a writer took a piece of paper and through the medium of words alone was able to create a human being so real that it can evoke your very, very deepest emotions. There are two areas in which Jewish law has a lot to say about the use of words. There's an expression in Hebrew, Hakol Talui b'mazal, afilu Torah b'aron HaKodesh. Everything depends on luck, even the Torah scroll in the Ark. Which means that, most shuls have 4 or 5 Torahs. Sometimes very small shuls don't have so many, but most shuls have quite a number of Torahs in the Ark. And the lucky ones get read, and some don't get read for years at a time. So certain Jewish terms became widely known, and certain which are just as important are not so widely known. I'll give you an example of it right now. How many of you are familiar with the term Lashon Hara? I would say a significant majority of the people here. How many of you are familiar with the term Ona'at Devarim? A somewhat lower percentage, like about 98% lower. I want to explain what they both mean. Okay, so let's start with Lashon Hara. Anybody want to offer a definition of Lashon Hara? And don't be afraid you're going to make a mistake, because even if I'm going to add something on, nobody's going to be embarrassed. Yes? Wait, so, okay, when you say something negative about a person, do you say even if it's true, or and it is true? Even. Yeah, Lashon Hara, this is the interesting thing. Lashon Hara is when you say something negative about a person that is true. It specifically refers to something that's true. There's another term that we're going to speak about later, Motzi Shemra. Motzi Shemra is when you say something negative about a person, and in addition to being negative, it's not even true. But the fascinating insight of Judaism is, even if it's true, that doesn't necessarily justify saying it. And it's an interesting discussion in Jewish ethics when it is permissible to spread something. But as a general rule, the fact that something is true doesn't mean that it should be permitted. Now, I'll tell you why. It's common sense. How many people here, as you can tell, I tend to be a little interactive. How many people here, by a showing of hands, can think of at least one incident in their lives that they would be highly embarrassed if it became known to everybody else. Okay? I'm assuming that those people who have not raised their hand have led very boring lives, are not telling the truth, or have very poor memories. Okay, we can all think of it. And we would regard somebody who told it to other people as an enemy. Somebody who's really damaging us, even if the person said, well, why shouldn't I say it? It's true, isn't it? Because not all truths need to be made known to other people. In fact, a large majority of them need not be made known. Let me ask, how many of you, if you were asked to be appointed to a high federal position, and it's irrelevant who the president is, whether it's under Trump or whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, in which you knew that your positions are offensive to some people and your whole life would be placed under tremendous scrutiny, with people going around asking people, and this is done on both sides. This is not a conservative failing or a liberal failing. In my view, it's a failing of both. But they'll go around asking everybody who's known you, have you heard any bad rumors about him? You know anything bad about him, or something like that? How many of you would not want to have your life subjected to great scrutiny? Yeah, okay, right. Barry Weiser raised both hands. Okay. So we see that Lashon Hara, which I want to go on to speak about a little more in greater depth later, can play a very detrimental role in society. In fact, I have a theory that people who are really quite good, but are more sensitive, are more apt, perhaps, to avoid putting their name in before public notice because they are more easily embarrassed. And we all have things that we don't necessarily want looked into in scrutiny. So I don't think it's raised the quality of life. There's another reason I also know. I said earlier, I know I'm not a prophet because in '96 I said civil discourse in America couldn't get any worse. I'll give you another example. I remember when Watergate happened in '73, I thought no more people who've done immoral things will go into political life. Because it seemed like everything would get exposed, so nobody would have chutzpah. So now people hire people to do things for them or have a lesser sense of shame. And then I mentioned the other term, ona'at devarim. Ona'at devarim, I said, is as important as the laws of Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara means speaking bad about others. Ona'at devarim means literally oppressing others. In other words, hurting people with how you speak to them. And my argument is I think for most of us, we have suffered as much, if not more, by things that people have said to us as by things that people have said about us. I think if you listen in, let's say in a therapist's office, I think a lot of people will confide how they were hurt in life by things that were said to them, maybe even more than things that were said about them. I'll give one obvious example where people need to exercise more control. How many people here wish they had greater control over their tempers? Okay, now I'm going to get an even more truthful answer to that question. How many people here are seated next to someone who they wish had greater control? Control of temper is a very, very big issue, and it goes back even into the Bible. Think about it. The very first crime that the Bible describes that ever happened between whom? Cain and Abel. And God sort of knew what was coming because apparently Cain had a bad temper. And God actually is quoted as saying to Cain in the Bible, I want to get the quote, exact. What happens is Abel and Cain both bring sacrifices to God. For whatever the reason is, the Bible is not explicit whether Abel's sacrifice represented more of a real sacrifice on his part or not. But in any case, God is happier with Abel's sacrifice, and Cain gets very upset, and God says to him, Lama charalacha? Why are you getting angry? Lama nachu panecha? Why is your face fallen? Hello, im tativ se'et. If you act well, you will be happier. You will be better for you. The im lo tativ, if you don't act in any better way. Sin crouches at the door, and its desire is towards you. Avatatim sholbo, and you can control it. In other words, we are told that we can control our tempers. It's very unhealthy when people say that they can't control their tempers, because they've already set the stage that they can do terrible things. The essence of Judaism, as much as anything, is, first of all, I say not monotheism, is not belief in one God, it's ethical monotheism. Belief in one God whose primary demand of human beings is ethical behavior. The Islamist terrorists claim to be pure monotheists. They might only believe in one God, but it's clear from their behavior that they don't believe that that God's primary demand of human beings is ethical behavior, because they do things that are simply so awful. So it's very important. So that's one thing. And the other is the belief in free will. By the way, the belief in God and free will is a very, very important and not obvious thing. And I'll tell you why it's not obvious. If you don't believe in God, if you don't believe that there is anything higher than the physical, then what are the determinants of human behavior? And when you think about it, it's usually two things. It's heredity and environment. What's the heredity you're getting from your parents, and what's the environment in which you're raised? I remember I once saw a cartoon showing a young boy, probably about 9 or 10 years old, and he's looking at his report card, and the father, with a big scowl on his face, is looking over the kid's shoulder at his report card, which is filled with D's and F's. And the boy says to his father, "What do you think it is, Dad, heredity or environment?" The Jew. And by the way, I'm not just making this up, it's not I'm just creating a straw man. Probably the most famous criminal defense lawyer in American history was Clarence Darrow. Darrow was very famous in the early part of the 20th century, and Darrow was simultaneously probably the most famous religious skeptic in the United States. And Darrow opposed prison. Nobody's going to be surprised that he opposed capital punishment. First of all, many, many people opposed capital punishment, and Darrow was you're not going to meet too many criminal defense lawyers who think capital punishment should be allowed. But Darrow actually opposed all imprisonment, not just for white-collar crime, because he felt that human beings had no free will. And it came out of Darrow's skepticism or agnosticism or atheism, however you want to define it, because he believed people were products of their heredity and their environment, and they really couldn't control it. The Jewish insistence is that atatim shogo, you can control it. And I don't know how many of you ever came across this, but there was a fascinating discussion of this verse about atatim shogo, and you can control it, in a classic work of American literature. It's a novel by John Steinbeck called East of Eden. How many of you ever read it? Okay, that's actually quite a number. If you remember, the novel is sort of based on the Cain and Abel story. And in the middle of the novel, there's a character, a Chinese guy, who's sort of the wise man. I see somebody nodding along, so he's very reassuring of your speaker. And sort of a Chinese wise man who claimed that that story in the Bible had changed his life. Because he said he was curious, what exactly did it mean, Vatatim Sholbo? And if you look at the King James Version, it's very optimistic. It says, and you shall rule over your anger. And so it's like saying God will do it. And the other one, in the Revised Standard Version, it was a little different, and you may rule over it. But he said he went and brought it to San Francisco. This is all in Steinbeck's novel, I'm not making this up. He went up to the sages of the Chinese people in San Francisco. He showed them this verse, and they hired a rabbi. It's hard to believe this is really in the novel. And they hired a rabbi, and for 2 years, they studied Hebrew just so that they could understand this verse. And they ended up saying, no, it means you can control it. In other words, there really is a human ability to control it. And I came across this because I was working on editing a commentary on the book of Genesis. And I was very excited about it. And I had, I had a big copy of Genesis. And in the health club where I worked out, somebody saw me unpacking my things. A young African-American man saw me. He said, that's the Bible, right? And I said, yes. And he starts talking to me, and I realize he's quite knowledgeable about the Bible. And I tell him about, this is I've had a few very, very odd coincidences in my life, and probably they're not coincidences. But one of them was, I tell him I'm working right now on the Cain and Abel story. He says, he opens up his shirt and he shows me he had tattooed on his chest in Hebrew the word Timshol, which means you shall rule over it. Steinbeck thought this story was so important that literally on the last page of the novel, the last word spoken in the novel and untranslated is the word Timshol, which spelled obviously is Timshol. But the free will should become so central, and I'll tell you why. People say, oh, I can't control my temper. Of course they can control their temper. Let's say you're ranting at your family, who unfortunately are often the recipients of people's bad tempers, and suddenly there's a knock on the door and 3 of your close friends come in. And are you going to keep screaming like that? No, obviously you'll calm down. So people say, okay, you'll calm down, and then you'll start screaming again after they leave. But first of all, the fact that you can calm down means you can for a period of time. But I'll give you an even stronger example. Can you think of anybody in the world whom you would hate more than a mugger? You're walking down the street, suddenly somebody confronts you, God forbid, with a knife or a gun. Is there anybody in the world you could hate more? And do you start spewing out your hatred? No, you actually act very respectfully. Oh, you want my wallet? You want my wallet? Here's my wallet. Here's my credit cards. You just want because you feel your life is at stake, so you can control it. But I'll give you a happier example. All of you who raised your hands that you wish you had better control over your temper, what if the following offer was made to you? If you reduce your explosions of anger by 75% over the next 6 months, you will receive $2 million. How many of us have become geniuses at learning how to control our temper? We'd almost want incidents to happen just so that we could show that we can control our temper. So free will is important because in the absence of a $2 million incentive, many people destroy relationships that are worth far more than $2 million. And how many of your families at the level of first cousin and closer are their relatives not on speaking terms? Is Memphis a city of saints? I've never said, really? Okay, hands are finally starting to go up. I mean, it's not like I'm happy to see a lot of hands, but we know these originate in family fights. And later on, the children are said to people, don't even know why the fight started. They just know that so-and-so and so-and-so are not speaking. And it's terrible. I think I'm a parent. I got married late in life. I got married at 39. And I accepted this speech. And I then realized it's on my birthday. So today is actually my birthday. Thank you. Among the people who did not applaud when they found out I accepted a speech on this day was my wife. You know. But in any case, now I forgot the point I wanted to make. Wait, what was the point I was making? It's a very stupid speech to start to address it. Yes, and how many of the families, you know, I have 4 children. I can think of few things that I would regard as more tragic than if the day, and God forbid this, it hasn't happened, but if God forbid my children or 2 of my children were not on speaking terms. Sometimes people will come to me, brothers and sisters are not on speaking terms. And I'll say, you know, you think you're respectful to your parents? You all think the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother, is a big deal? Guess what? If you can't find some way to forgive, some way to live with that sibling, it's an act of disrespect towards your parents. It will break your parents' heart. But again, these things almost always originate in words. And, you know, the terrible things people say to each other. So what can you do about anger? I want to give you 2 points. One is a guideline. If you observe this guideline, you can leave here today, and if you observe this guideline, you will never say something in anger that will permanently destroy a relationship. And that is, no matter how angry you get at another person, restrict the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it. What happens is when people get angry, they start summoning up things from 10 years ago. You know, they summon up everything. And one of the sad things about anger, and this is a sad thing, is that people assume that what people say when they're angry is what they really feel. But the truth is, when people say when they're angry, is what they really feel at that moment. In the course of the day, we go through a lot of different emotions. When my kids were very small, and I had to get up at 2 in the morning to feed somebody, You really think all I was thinking was, oh, I so love having only 2 hours of sleep and having the great privilege of feeding my child. You know, but we all know we get angry, and anger can be a very irrational emotion. Anger is, of course, sometimes justified, but people do things often when they're angry, or say things when they're angry, that aren't really what they feel. And so it's very important, if you restrict the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it, make a very big difference. And the other thing is to learn how to apologize. And this is so important, and it's very important what an apology means. Apologies, first of all, have to be wholehearted. You can't, when you apologize, I'll give you an example from my own life. Many years ago, when two of my daughters were really quite young, they were 4 and 6, I was giving a speech in Denver, and the issue of anger came up. I had been writing and thinking about the whole issue of words for a long time. And so two of my daughters, Shira, who was then 4, and Naomi, who was 6, said, Daddy, we were living in Boulder. So Daddy, we want to come to your speech. Boulder's about an hour's drive from Denver. So I, of course, discouraged them. They were 4 and 6. The speech was going to be way over their heads. And I said, you're not going to really be interested. And they said, Daddy, we know you travel around giving speeches. We want to come. Okay, so I bring them. I'm a very proud father. Fortunately, there was a large audience, probably comparable to tonight. They walk in, I introduce Naomi, I introduce Shira, everybody applauds, and I sit down in the front row. About 10 minutes into the speech, I asked the audience a question. How many of you grew up in a household where somebody's bad temper had a bad effect on the house? Among the hands that go up were 2 hands in the front row. Hearing the story now, you can imagine how people who actually were physically present started laughing. Finally, I said the only thing I could. Unfortunately, my wife has a terrible temper. What had happened was, Naomi was in the 1st grade. The school she was at was not operating at the level we had hoped, and I was teaching her how to read. And according to my wife, the first time I explained something to someone, I'm very patient. And the second time I explain something, I'm also very patient, but apparently by the 3rd time, I can start getting a little snappy. So I've been snapping at Naomi. So after the speech, I went over and I said to her, I said, Naomi, for me to get angry when you make a mistake is wrong, because you're not making a mistake to be bad, and it's hurtful to you. And if I ever do that, first of all, I apologize, and if I do it again in the future, I want you to say to me, Daddy, you're not supposed to do that. Which he actually did start saying, which was extremely irritating. But the point is, the apology has to be full-hearted. Can you imagine if I said, Naomi, it was wrong of me to get angry. Really, please, I apologize. But you do have to admit, it is pretty irritating when you keep making the same mistake over and over. You know, you take away all the power of the apology. I came across a story, an episode which apparently really happened. How many of you remember, well, none of you are going to remember it from your own lives because it happened over a century ago, but how many of you know who was the first Jew ever appointed to the Supreme Court? Yeah, Louis Brandeis. Today, we take it for granted that appointments to the court are very political and that the votes tend to divide often along party lines. But in most of American history, people were voted in with overwhelming percentages. By the way, sometimes even some of the current justices. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg became a justice, I think she got in by like a vote of 96-2 or something. But in Brandeis's time, usually they were not political at all, except when Brandeis got nominated, because then there really was, people weren't as embarrassed to be anti-Semitic in those days. Since the Holocaust, people are embarrassed to be anti-Semitic, which is the reason for the origins of why many anti-Semites, so they just say they're anti-Zionists. But anti-Semitism, most people wouldn't do it. I'm working on a project to develop a Jewish museum in northern Tel Aviv that's going to be a museum on what Jews and Judaism have contributed to the world. Because 70% of the museums in the world are one way or another Holocaust related. And I was approached by a woman, Gail Asper, of a foundation in Winnipeg, and one of the inducements she told me was the architect of the project was Frank Gehry. And Gary, of course, is really quite a preeminent architect. And I never knew that Gary was Jewish. His name is Frank Goldberg. He's an older man. When he got out of architecture school around 1950, so he told me he couldn't get a job. And then one architecture firm said to him, we don't care that you're Jewish, it doesn't matter to us, but you can't have the name Goldberg. So he made up this name Gary. But, so we see that, now again I went on a digression. What's the point I was making? I want to see who's listening. Obviously I'm not. What? Oh, right. So, thank you. Thank you. This is the whole assured. I don't know if I would have made those errors. Every time you make an error as you're getting older, you always assume it has something to do with getting older. That's the insidious quality of getting older. I mean, the alternative is worse. But, so, when Brandeis is nominated to the Supreme Court, 6 former presidents of the American Bar Association issue a public letter why he would be terrible. He's the worst sort of person. He's a hypocrite. I think they might even mention his Jewishness. But there was a real campaign against Brandeis. One of the leaders of the campaign, who really was not an anti-Semite, but who really did despise Brandeis, was the former American president, William Howard Taft. Taft, for whatever reasons, he had hated a lot of the decisions Brandeis had made as a lawyer, the cases, the causes he had undertaken, and he called him a hypocrite and wrote a public letter about it. About 3 years later, Brandeis used to take an evening walk. He was walking near his house in Washington, and sure enough, he comes up against Taft. And Taft says to him, Mr. Brandeis, 3 years ago, I said some very wrong things about you. And I want you to know I'm very sorry, and I apologize. It ended the feud. He didn't say, Mr. Brandeis, I said some unfair things about you, but some of your positions really were terrible. He didn't do that. Strangely enough, Taft becomes the only former president who then gets appointed to the Supreme Court, where he becomes a Chief Justice. And in Taft's papers, we find a letter he wrote 2 years after he became Chief Justice, in which he wrote to his daughter, he said, I still have real political and other judicial disagreements with Brandeis, but I now regard him as a real friend and I have great affection for him. So that's what an apology can do when you really open it up. And that's why that becomes so important. Okay, now about Lashon Hara, which I was starting with earlier. In Jewish law, there are 3 levels of Lashon Hara. The first is, we wouldn't even think of it, trivial, non-defamatory. Oh, I was at a party at so-and-so's house last night. It's amazing what they've done with their kitchen. What could possibly be wrong with that? Well, the other person might be thinking, wait, you were invited to that party? Why wasn't I invited? Or, really, they spent so much on their kitchen. Now I know I solicited them to give to the JCC building fund. They said they had no money. It was all going on their kitchen. The reason for trivial, non-defamatory gossip, trying to stop it, I'll tell you what the reason is. Because it rarely remains trivial and non-defamatory. One of the ways in which Lashon Hara could be eliminated or greatly diminished is if you never spoke about another person for more than 2 minutes. The moment you start speaking at length about another person, how many times can you say, oh yeah, that story that shows how nice she is? I know an even nicer story. If I divided this whole room up tonight into groups of 2 and asked you to spend 20 minutes speaking about someone you know in common, do you really think for 20 minutes you only share nice stories? You wouldn't, and I'll tell you why. Because what's interesting about people is what's not so nice. My wife, Devorah, worked for many years for the Yiddish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer. Devorah started out as a sort of a secretary, and then she really became also an editor, and she worked with Isaac on translations. Because Isaac's English was good, but it was not literary. So he needed to work on his translations. And she became the one person he sort of tried to teach the craft of writing. She has remarkable stories about Isaac. So anyway, but Devorah said one of the things she remembered Isaac saying was, even good people don't like to read novels about good people. It's true. If somebody has a great novels, the hero has no flaws, really interesting. It won't be really interesting. I've written in my life 4 murder mysteries. The fact that almost none of you know that is one of the reasons why I haven't in 5 years. And, so why don't I write a good mystery? What's a good mystery? Somebody's been doing anonymous good deeds in the community, and there are 5 suspects. I actually thought that would be a great book to bring out around Hanukkah and the Hanukkah Christmas season. Just literally call it a good mystery about somebody who does it. Because again, if you and I are talking about someone we know in common, and I say to you, I love that guy. There's only one thing I can't stand about him. What are we going to talk about? So that's why trivial, non-defamatory gossip rarely remains trivial and non-defamatory. And that's why I said if people would only speak about somebody for 2 minutes, if you start analyzing any time that you've spoken about somebody at great length, maybe there's a rare exception if you're really speaking. Speak to a Chabad chassid about the Rebbe, you can speak for 2 hours without any negative stories coming up. But as a general rule, it's not a good thing in human nature. Then you come to Lashon Hara. And the problem, of course, with Lashon Hara is it is negative and it is interesting. And again, the problem becomes, but it defames the other person. Why is Lashon Hara so bad? Why is it so bad if somebody spreads that embarrassing story about you? Probably most of us are not concealing terrible crimes we committed or something like that, but it's something a little shocking, scandalous, there might be a sexual component or something else, and as a result, that becomes people's primary association with us. It's inevitable. If you know many good things, but one really embarrassing thing comes out, everybody's going to remember that. So Lashon Hara is inherently so unfair. And it's amazing, can you go? I try and challenge people. That's what I wanted to do in that congressional bill, that Senate bill, and I'm still hoping to get it reactivated. What happened was when I originally tried it, so I really met with Joe Lieberman, and not surprisingly, Lieberman immediately picked up on the Jewishness of it, and he said to if you're going to meet with a senator, probably any high public official, will always be someone from their staff there, because there has to be somebody who can do follow-up. And the woman I remember was working with Senator Lieberman, who was not Jewish, but he said to her, so it was clear that she knew, he said, this will be a big mitzvah for you to do. So it was clear that people who worked in Lieberman's office knew that. And then the other was Connie Mack, who was a senator from Florida, and he and Lieberman were really quite close. And he also encouraged his assistant to get very involved in this. But I found out that you really need to have like 50 senatorial co-sponsors. So you really got introduced into the Senate, but it was not high on anybody else's agenda. So I want to work with an organization. It could be Chabad, it could be Hillel, an organization that has people all over the country, who could have access to senators, because it's hopefully not that controversial sort of thing. But I would want to ask people, it's now 5 to 6. Can you go to 5 to 6 tomorrow without saying anything negative about or to anyone? Because people say, yeah, I can do it, but see if you really can. Can you do it? Just try it. I once told people, if you have trouble doing it for 24 hours, pick 2 hours a day and you won't say anything negative. And then somebody said to me, okay, 3 to 5 a.m. A good time is, at a meal. It's a terrible thought for me. I'm a religiously observant Jew, but I think a lot of Lashon Hara is often spoken at Shabbos tables, which is one of the reasons why it's very good at Shabbos table if you speak about the Torah portion of the week, if you sing Zmiris, if you sing songs, because otherwise when people are relaxing, they often say things that are not that nice. And it's a hard temptation to overcome. There's a famous teaching in the Sifra, which is one of the Talmudic sources, which is very counterintuitive. How many of you think that Judaism doesn't like pigs? You associate Judaism with having a negative attitude towards pigs. I think most of us assume it, which is peculiar because if you were a pig, you would like Judaism. If you were a chicken, you would like Judaism. So there's actually a teaching in the Sifra that says a Jew is not supposed to say, I hate pig, I don't want to eat pig. You should say, I would like to eat it, but it's forbidden. In other words, it's supposed to teach us a certain level of self-control. So I once saw a piece written by one of my favorite people in the Jewish world, Abraham Tversky, who's a Hasidic dynasty and a psychiatrist. And he said, interesting, he said, for most Jews who are raised in observant households, there really isn't a big temptation to eat pig. It's not, it's not, a cheeseburger could sound interesting. Now, thank God they have these vegetarian hamburgers, so you can get a sense of it. Because they're inherently kosher foods, they just can't be combined. If you grow up, believe me, it's never been hard for me to avoid shellfish. I don't have the temptation. So he said, so kashrut obviously still has to be observed, but it doesn't have that same function of creating such a sense of self-discipline. He said, but the laws of Lashon Hara do. It is tempting to speak critically of others and share information that other people don't need to have. Somebody tells you they want to go into business with someone and you know reasons why it would not be wise, but factual reasons. You can't say, I have a feeling. It has to be something you tangibly know. Somebody wants to get involved with someone and you know in their previous relationship they were divorced because he was a wife beater or something. You can, in limited instances, you can tell it. But you're not supposed to go around telling, you don't need to tell these things to everybody. Oh, he's a lazy worker. He'll come into the office at 11 and he'll leave by 3. You don't have to tell that to everybody else, but tell it where it's relevant. And otherwise, try and avoid it. So Tversky said, so try and overcome that temptation, because that's a real challenge. So I'm going to say try and overcome. Now you only have to do 23 hours and 55 minutes. It's getting better. But that really becomes a factor. I have a theory about it. In which month do you think the least Lashon Hara is spoken? Somebody said Tishrei because of the high holidays. My theory is February, because it's 28 days. in leap years, more Lashon Hara is spoken. So, that's the point. But can you overcome it and try it one day at a time and see how you feel? And by the way, if you mess up, so go back. Don't say, well, I messed up, now it's over, I can't do it. Go back and try and do it. And most of us will find that we probably say somewhat hurtful or overly negative or unfair comments more often than we think we do in any period of time. So that's another thing about Lashon Hara. Then there's that third category I mentioned, and then I'm going to end the speech on words that heal, which will be a little more inspiring at least. Another thing about Lashon Hara, and this is in another category beyond Lashon Hara, is what I said before, Motzi Shem Ra. Motzi Shem Ra is when you say something that's not true about another person. And I'm going to tell you something, you're going to be surprised. Probably every single one of us has done this. When you say something not true about another person, it's harmful. And you're going to think, I don't do that. You do it without realizing it when you routinely pass on rumors. Most rumors are not, hey, did you hear that so-and-so is really a wonderful person? Rumors are generally critical. And if they turn out to be inaccurate, then you really damage somebody else's reputation. So you got to be very careful then when you transmit a rumor, because it can do tremendous damage. And often they're not true. But people generally assume that they are true. And it stays part of what they remember about other people. I know people who were victims of terrible rumors, and years later, other people still believe that they were true. There's always a tendency that nobody would just make that up. And yeah, people can make up things or lead to terrible conclusions. I want to say something about words that heal. I mentioned one aspect of words that heal when I spoke about my apologies to my daughters. And apologizing is very, very important, because if we've hurt somebody, we have to undo the hurt. And then also there are stories when you're dealing with the vulnerable. I'll just tell a few stories because I've been speaking for quite a while, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. There's a remarkable book called My Grandfather's Blessings. Are any of you familiar with it? It's a great book. You go on Amazon and order it. It's by a woman who's a doctor. Actually, the truth is I've fallen out of touch. I hope she's still with us. She'd be on in years, but it's a extraordinary book by Rachel Naomi Remen. And the book, she tells the story. She said, I grew up in a household. It was a secular sort of house, a secular household, and the sort of household where if I got a 98 on a test, my dad would say, what happened to the other 2 points? And as she put it, I spent a good part of my younger years pursuing those 2 points. The one place where she didn't feel she had to pursue those 2 points was at her grandfather's house. Her grandfather was a somewhat pious Jew, and every Friday after school, she would go to her grandfather's house, and she'd sit with him, and as evening started to approach, he'd light the Shabbat candles, and he would bless her. And I'm sure many of you know the blessing. How do you bless girls? You say, may God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And in the case of boys, you say, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. By the way, it's an interesting question. It's obvious when we say the four mothers, while we're saying it, logically you'd think we would say the boys, may God make you like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why do we say Ephraim and Manasseh? Because Joseph really had 2 sons named that. They were named, and Jacob actually blesses them. So Jacob blesses them in the Bible. Another rabbi once pointed out to me, the reason we really do it is because they're the only 2 brothers who get along in Genesis. May God make you like Jacob and Esau, not exactly the blessing that I offer to all. Anyway, but Rachel Remen's grandfather did something a little different, and when I read it, it totally changed the way I blessed my children. In addition to giving them that blessing, he would always add on something they had done that week that had impressed him. And that became very important. She said if she had managed to sleep for a few hours without requiring an electric light to be on in the room, he spoke of that. If she had done well on a test, he mentioned that. If she hadn't done well on a test, but she had tried hard, he would mention that. And then the very sad thing that happened to her was that when she was only 7, her grandfather died. And she said, at first, I wondered, how would I be able to go on? Who would represent me before God? And she then said she came to realize that she had learned to see herself through her grandfather's eyes. And that once blessed, the person remains blessed forever. As beautiful as that story is, it has an additional punchline. Years later, to Remen's great surprise, her mother started to become a little more ritually observant, and her mother, for the first time, started lighting Shabbat candles. And she was sitting with her mother once, and she told her mother the story of the grandfather's blessings. It's the first time she ever told the mother the story. And the mother looked at her at the end and said, Rachel, I want you to know that I have blessed you every day of your life, but unlike your grandfather, I didn't have the wisdom to say the blessing out loud. That's the power. I'm going to tell 2 more just brief stories. I hope these are not anticlimactic, because that story, as you can see, it's hard for me to tell it and not be very moved. One story is, and you'll be shocked to hear this, Alan Dershowitz years ago wrote a book called Letters to a Young Lawyer, which was pretty autobiographical, and Dershowitz records in the book. How many of you ever heard Dershowitz speak? Okay, so now you'll be a little surprised. Dershowitz records, he said, I was 15 years old before anybody ever told me I was smart. And so, he grew up not thinking neither of his parents had gone to college. His father sold pants in a men's clothing store, and he said, I assumed I was going to also work in a clothing store, and I wasn't a good student in school. He said, because what was the point? How much geography did I need to know? How much algebra did I need to know in order to sell clothes in the store? Then one summer, he went to an Orthodox camp. Dershowitz came from a very observant Jewish household, and he was working there as a waiter. And he was about 15, 16, and there was a somewhat older guy, a man in his younger 20s, who was the drama counselor at the camp. And Dershowitz says, that's the age when you're starting to grow and expand, and you're talking about a lot of things. He said, we talk about everything. We talk about philosophies of religion, or Judaism itself, girls, all the things you'd expect a teenage boy like that. He liked, this guy was older and very smart. And one day this guy said to Dershowitz 5 words, you're really smart. Now you'd think it's just like a routine comment. Dershowitz claims that those 5 words changed his life. He said, I never thought of myself as being smart, and this guy had no reason to compliment me. This guy, who went on to get a PhD from Harvard, was, had no reason to say it, but he was clearly impressed. So happens the man who said it later on also became a rabbi, and he was the rabbi who performed my wedding, Yitz Greenberg, who's probably at one point or another been down here. And I remember when I read that in Dershowitz's book, I called him, I'm somewhat friendly I'm friendly obviously with Yitz, and I called him up, and he was very pleased to hear that Dershowitz had written. He said Dershowitz really had told him that over the years, that he had transformed his life. We never know how, we are so conscious of how words can hurt people, of how some devastating criticism or put down, and it's easier, by the way, to be witty when you say something snide. It's harder to be witty when you say, a real compliment. But those words were transformative, and Dershowitz insists to this day. I've had occasion a number of times to engage in public dialogues with him, and he insisted that that really was the case. I'll give you one other story like that. How many of you younger people here will not remember this name? But how many of you remember Alan Sherman? He used to write these funny songs like Hello, What a Hello, Father. Sherman grew up, I think, like in the late 30s, and it was somewhat atypical in those days. But his mother was divorced. In those days there were fewer divorces, and it was considered a more shameful thing. And his mother, to boot, was not doing very well financially, so they lived with his Yiddish-speaking grandmother. Anyway, one day when Sherman is 8 years old, he wakes up in the morning, and he knows they're having a bit of a party that night. People are coming over, and he hears his grandmother say that she needs a football. So he's utterly puzzled. Why does his grandmother need a football? But he's an 8-year-old boy. An 8-year-old boy wants to be the hero. So he goes out with his most valuable toys, tries to exchange it with other kids in the neighborhood. Finally, some bully kid punches him, but then agrees for all of his best toys, he'll give him a football. So he gives him the football, he goes home, sort of polishes the football, and then leaves it for his grandmother to find when she comes home. Instead, his mother comes home and says, Alan, I told you, don't leave your toys around. And so he says to his mother, no, it's for Grandma. She said, what do you mean it's for Grandma? Grandma said she needs a football. His mother starts laughing and says, Alan, you don't understand your own grandmother? She needs a football. He is utterly humiliated. He goes up to his room, he slams the door, and won't come out of his room. He hears the people coming, and about an hour later, his mother comes up and says, Alan, Grandma insists you have to come down. He goes down and sees his grandmother with a large football and a football in the middle. And when people say that, what is that doing? She explains and says, when a child is beautiful, anything. It utterly pacified his heart. So look at the power we have. We all know the power of words to hurt. But we got to be as conscious of it. It would be unconscionable. It would be exceedingly unfair of God if he only gave words the power to hurt. But there is compensatory. There are sicknesses in the world, and then there are medicines. And this can be an amazing transformative medicine. About a little over 200 years ago, one of the early masters of Hasidism, Nachman of Bratslav, died. And one of Rabbi Nachman's teachings was, if you're not going to be a better person tomorrow than you were today, what need do you have for tomorrow? I realized I once concluded a speech like that. Somebody said, Joseph, that's a real downer. So let me transform it a little. I'll rephrase Rabbi Nachman a little. I wish all of you were very good today and an even better tomorrow. Thank you very much. We have time for Q&A? Okay, good. Yes.
You talked about rage and anger, and I don't know if this would hurt myself, but generally my anger and rage is hurt myself. When friends hear this, or friends they're quite positive, they say, Ricky, you're very passionate, giving of other people. So what advice would you helping me out?
Yeah, okay. As important as the words are that we speak to other people and about other people are the words that we speak to ourselves. I'll tell you a story out of Jewish, I don't know if this happened exactly like this, or maybe it comes out of Jewish folklore, but it's a remarkable story. There was, and then I'm going to tell it and then I'm going to relate it even more to you. There was a very famous Eastern European rabbinic sage who's known by the title of his first book, the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim was particularly known to be involved with the whole issue of Lashon Hara, not speaking unfairly of others. He lived during the last time in history when it was possible to be famous without being recognized. Because he had a very long life. He lived from 1838 to 1933. So he publishes this book in the 1870s, and nobody, to this day, I think there's only one photograph of him. But he's going around speaking about the book. So he's on a train or in a wagon, and there's another religious Jew there, and they start talking, and he says to the other guy, so where are you going? He says, oh, going into town to hear the Chafetz Chaim speak. He's the greatest Talmid Chacham, he's the greatest sage, and the greatest tzaddik, and the greatest saint in the Jewish world today. The Chafetz Chaim is a little embarrassed to hear himself described in such grandiose terms. So he says to the man, I also happen to know the Chafetz Chaim. He's not such a scholar, he's not such a saint. The other man gets so angry at hearing him speaking so disrespectfully that he slaps him. So he slaps the Chafetz Chaim. That night, the man goes to the speech, and he sees that the speaker is none other than the Chafetz Chaim. So he goes over to him afterwards and says, Rabbi, I have no idea who you are. Please forgive me. The Chafetz Chaim says, I have nothing to forgive you for. It was my honor you were defending. On the contrary, though, I learned an important lesson from you. I keep telling people not to speak unfairly of others. Don't speak unfairly of yourself. I'm going to give you one piece of very, very practical advice. Try, at the end of the day, for a period of time, I don't know how long you'll do it, write down 3 things you did that day that you think reflect well on you. And I'll tell you why. First of all, even if you have trouble at first coming up with it, don't. And don't disqualify yourself because maybe your motives weren't good. So maybe do things even because you want to have something you can put down. My grandfather, Alav Shalom, who was a prominent Rav, once said to me, it's not terrible to get a reputation of being a tzaddik. He said, even if you're not a tzaddik, because then you'll be embarrassed to do things that you'd be very embarrassed if they got exposed. Now, if you develop a certain reputation for yourself. So try and list things that you can like about yourself. And it's very important because the word, believe me, when you're a rabbi, one of the joys of being a rabbi is you get exposed to a lot of happy events in people's lives. And one of the less happy parts of being a rabbi is you get disproportionately exposed to unhappy things in people's lives. Deaths, injuries from which there's not going to be a full recovery, things like that. And one of the saddest things is when somebody says to me, Rabbi, if things could only go back to being the way they used to be, I'd be so happy. But I knew them when things were the way they used to be, they weren't happy. So it's terrible if you can only appreciate happiness. So one of the things is, think about it, and think about compliments you got. I don't know what sort of household you were grown up in, but think of relatives you had who really loved you and who said really kind things to you. And think, they saw something in you, and you should be able to see it. Because otherwise it's a torment, to go through it and to be angry at yourself and think of your accomplishments. Listen, self-confidence does not equate with arrogance. Arrogance is when somebody thinks they're better than other people, and maybe because they were blessed with certain talents. But self-confidence because, look, we all know if you don't believe in yourself, it's going to be hard to inspire other people to believe in you. And that then just, can feed it. So I hope it's helpful. Okay, God willing. Thank you. And thank you for being willing to say that. Thank you. Because believe me, you are not the only person here who has to struggle with it. And I have struggled with that. Yes.
Do you give versions of this lecture to school children?
Do I give versions of this lecture to school children? Usually not at a very young age, but high school level. Yes, I've done. In fact, I had a great honor of doing it in Norfolk, Virginia. This was a very unusual thing. In Norfolk, Virginia, there is a school called the Norfolk Academy that has existed since 1728. It obviously is not a yeshiva. And, it was one of those schools that for much of its history was restricted. And, now Jews are about 15%. And it was like a big deal that I was in Norfolk to give other speeches. It was a big deal that they brought me in as a rabbi. And this is so repercussive and so significant. This is an issue that the reason I wanted that National Speak No Evil Day is I wanted to do it as a Jewish contribution to American life. You know, there's a lot of other things that are in Judaism religiously. There are similarities. Obviously, our prayers are different in certain ways from Christian prayers, but I don't know that the Christian world needs to learn from us how to pray. I wish they, I mean, yeah. Do you know the famous Jewish, there's a famous Midrashic story that there were two brothers, and one was rich and one was poor, and when they harvested their crops, the brother who was rich thought, oh, my poor brother, he has a family, he doesn't have enough, and so he went and took some of his crops and put it in the other brother's granary or wherever it was. And the brother who was poor said, my rich brother, the only thing he has is his wealth. He doesn't have a family. So he took from his stuff and put it there. And each morning they would wake up and they would wonder, how did they have the same amount of food since they had given it over? So the third night they made sure to stay up, and they ran into each other as they were doing it with the crops, and they realized what they had done, and they kissed, and that's where the temple was built. What's the modern Israeli version of that story? They run into each other, and each gets so annoyed at the other for having treated them, you know, feeling in a pitying way, they get into a fight, and that's where the Knesset is. That's weird. But the thing is, you really got to find, you know, those things really that you can love in yourself too. Yes. Yes.
First, I love your message. I just have a quick question about when we talk about success. There's kind of the old adage, the most successful people learn from other people's mistakes, and they learn from their own mistakes. And then there's the people that don't learn. If we can't talk about negative things like other people do, how do we learn to be more successful in life?
Okay, an interesting question. Okay, I'll repeat it. I'd be happy to repeat it if I thought I had a really good answer. No, it's a smart question. The question is, you can learn, smart people learn from their own mistakes, but smart people also learn from other people's mistakes. So can you legitimately talk about somebody else's mistakes and learn from it? And the answer is yes, but you got to restrict it to what you're doing. And I'll tell you why I say that. If you ever look through the Bible really can be quite unsparing in its details of things that people did. I mean, in the case of David, you know, there are sins and errors committed in the Bible. And my son, Ben, makes an interesting point. He says maybe they're put in the Bible to discourage people from speaking about Lashon Hara, because if they see it in the Bible, they'll discuss those cases and not trying to discuss it about everybody else. So if we're also talking in the realm of mistakes, but again, there's a level where you restrict how much you say. And just focus on that, on why you think it's a mistake, why someone may have made a mistake like that. What is there that you can learn from it? But don't just, you know, don't just focus on that. There's a charitable way to talk about other people. You know, one of my daughters once said to me when I was working on the original version of this book, is some people they'll ask when a relationship ends, they'll ask questions, but you can tell from their questions, are they really trying to be helpful, or are they really just trying to get the sordid details? And why you do it. Also, my father, alav shalom, had a wonderful trait. He really taught me, though, also to try and see things from another person's side. He said, if it's really a mistake, it's a mistake. But a lot of people really can get quite cruel in their analysis. Then understand why somebody made the mistake, maybe in a sympathetic way, and then explain why it was still a mistake. But don't always, you know, attribute sordid motives to it. So I think that could be helpful in doing it. Thank you. I want to really think about that more. It's a very smart question, which is not to imply that the previous questions were not smart. Yes, this is, now you're showing an obsession with Lashon Hara can turn a normal person into a total neurotic. Yes, back there.
Hi, so I'm a historian, and part of the historian's work is not really looking at the best deeds of everybody.
Right.
And that does involve Jewish people, since I am a Jewish studies minor. And I remember reading when I read the Chafetz Chaim to not speak badly even about the dead. So it brings into an ethical question of how am I supposed to do my job as a historian, and even journalists or other people who have to write about people who may not always have positive information. What are we supposed to do?
I think your job as an historian can be to reveal things if they're relevant to what people need to know and if they're not unfair. For example, it came out after the release of the film Schindler's List. You know, Schindler in his earlier life was a far from exemplary character. First of all, he was a Nazi originally. He was not a particularly ideological Nazi, but he wanted to make money from it. And Schindler's a very powerful example. I remember I once heard something that my friend Harold Kushner, I'm sure many of you know when bad things happen to good people, that Harold once said, Schindler represents a very powerful motive for repentance. Schindler was not a good person. He was willing to exploit people, but he was not a murderer. And when he realized that if he stayed involved with the Nazis, he'd be a murderer, that's what caused him to repent. It's an important thing for many of us. If we're on a certain track and we realize if we stay on that track, we're going to become worse people than we are now. But okay, Schindler was also a womanizer. Does that mean, again, what do people need to know? They need to know enough to make a fair assessment of somebody. But again, we go into sort of detail. People are not responsible in that regard. I'll give you an example of what I mean. If there was going to be a show on during the presidential candidacy in which you're going to have some fairly serious people, let's say historians or others, analyzing through an analysis, let's say, of historical observation or the positions of, let's say, even 5 past presidents. So historians look at it. And what was the impact of this behavior on the country and all other things. And at the same time, there was going to be a show on with 5 more gossipy sorts of people speaking about what we now know about the sex life of these 5 presidents. I have a sneaking suspicion, and I'm not happy about this, that more people would watch that show. So again, if it's really relevant to the details of what's going on, like there's endlessly fascinating stuff. I remember I read a biography some years ago by an historian in Nassau, NASAU. It was a biographical study of Joseph Kennedy, who was the patriarch of the whole Kennedy clan. And as some of you might know, he was America's ambassador to England. And he definitely has a pretty negative reputation in the Jewish community because he was one of those who wanted to appease Hitler. Not every story about him was terrible. He actually helped some individual Jews. But in my view, from my understanding of the sources, he played a terrible role. He was one of those who was trying to influence, and remember, America had a lot of influence on the British Prime Minister, Chamberlain, to appease Hitler, because he was convinced that the German army was strong and he was very close with Lindbergh. These are all valid and fair things to analyze, but one shouldn't go into it looking out for the scandalous details that often interest people. And that's what it's. You know what it is? It's a fine line. And it's almost impossible. Somebody asked me many years ago. I know I'm flitting from subject to subject, but this is it. It just occurred to me. Somebody asked me. I always insist on the supremacy of the ethical in Judaism. That the Bein Adam L'Makam, the laws between people and God, are extremely important. But Hillel, the most famous story told about Hillel. This question will be answered at some point within the next half hour. No, the most famous story told about Hillel is a story where he defines Judaism's essence to a non-Jew in one sentence. Who knows? If anybody knows the story, tell. Okay, so what does he say to the guy? Somebody give you a, you know what, my hearing isn't fantastic. Could somebody please give her the mic? Yes.
Comfort to stand on one foot and give the message, and that was basically do unto others as you would unto yourself, and that's the essence of Judaism. Now go learn instead.
Okay, right. You're close. You're close. He actually defines it negatively. What's hateful unto you, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto others. The rest is commentary. But what motivated him to even, now we can take somebody else. What motivated him? What did the non-Jew say to him that caused him to give that one sentence definition? Yes.
Non-Jew wanted to be taught the whole Torah standing on one
Okay, the non-Jew wanted to be taught the Torah while standing on one leg. That's not exactly, well, it's close to what he said. What he actually said was, people generally assume, he said to me, teach me what Judaism is all about. I was while standing on one leg. And it sort of makes sense that Hillel gives that ethical response, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. Because most of us, if we're speaking with non-Jews, if you're speaking to a Protestant, to a Catholic, to a Muslim, to a Mormon, most of us would tend to gravitate towards the commonalities. That's the essence. But what the non-Jew in the story of the Talmud actually says to Hillel is a little different. He says, Gayabeni almanach, convert me to Judaism on condition you can teach it to me all while standing on one foot. And he then goes back to the ethical. So the fact that he puts that emphasis on the ethical means that he really saw it as central. And I think that becomes, in a sense, the issue. Be ethically fair, even though what most people are interested in is not necessarily the ethical. It can be a little more of the scandalous and other things. But you have to set out to be fair. Now, it's true. You cannot. There are certain biographies of great Jewish sages that get written by presses that I think can overly romanticize people, because that's the nature of the audiences that want it. So I think the question is it true? Is it fair? And are you making it clear what it is? And is it an analysis? To some extent, when you become a public figure, you do give up certain rights of privacy. I think what's gone bad in America is that you give up all rights of privacy. You become fair game for anything, which, as I said, would scare many people legitimately out of public life. Having said that, though, once you've done certain acts that you've done as public acts in particular, so you can't control. If they have bad results, or bad results you could have anticipated, that's fair to speak about. It's an ongoing dispute. I'll say even among religious Jewish historians, it's an ongoing dispute. Was it an error? A lot of Eastern European rabbis did not want Jews to come live in America. Jews, as a rule, thought of America as the golden Medina, the golden land. In the Orthodox world, and there was a basis for it, they saw America as the Treifa Medina, the land where people will become irreligious. So the question then becomes, once you take a public position, the Chafetz Chaim, for whom I have a very high regard, actually wrote a letter after World War I urging Jews to come back from America to Eastern Europe. Because he thought they're going to lose all their religiosity in America. So it becomes complicated. My father was the accountant for the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And my father remembered a conversation that my father was present at, my grandfather was present at, and the previous Rebbe, who was known as the Frierdiker Rebbe, was present at. And the Frierdiker Rebbe made a comment in passing. He said, we made a big error. Once it became apparent that a lot of Jews were coming to America, we should have sent more people here. We should have established, shluchim, emissaries. We should have established yeshivas. And he didn't want to continue speaking. He just quoted a verse from Eicha, from the Book of Lamentations, Avotenu chatu veinam. Our fathers sinned, they are no more. Which, like Torah is not speaking ill of those, but it was clear. So again, the question is, do you become fair and you reveal only what needs to really be revealed? But the fairness question is a very, very good question. Particularly, I wouldn't go as much, even though I know, listen, I don't want to depict myself as being saintly. I also like to go into the private details of a person's life, trying to restrain myself. Look, it's a hard thing for many people. How would you like if you walked into somebody's room and they had left open their diary and said, I'm in the middle of an illicit affair with, not read it. One of the reasons it's good for people to be careful about how much Lashon Hara they speak is don't tempt other people. In the Sefer Chassidim, which is a 13th century ethical sort of Musar work, it said, if you see two people huddling and speaking, don't ask them what they were talking about, because then you're going to be the cause of causing them to lie. So we have to restrain ourselves. I wish I was better. My sister is great at that. I say something nice about, I hope she doesn't say the opposite about me. My brothers, I remember a friend who once when I was telling him about my book on Muslim Mary, says, "Oh, I'm really good at that stuff. Oh, my friend Jesse, he's terrible. He gossips all the time." Okay, thank you very much.